Over the years, on this stage at Idea City, I've had very many speakers address the issue of environmentalism, the issue of the planet, taking positions that are generally identified as progressive. And in all that time, I never once had anybody, either by phone or by email or by letter or whatever, object and immediately demand that the other side needed to be expressed or that these people should be suppressed. And yet a couple of years ago, when I brought forward people who had, I thought, some legitimate skepticism about some of the positions that were being espoused, I can go on with this list, suddenly the hectoring began. Suddenly I was getting the tweets. Suddenly there was all this outrage that not only were these people not correct, but I shouldn't be letting them to speak. And that's what got me going, because I began to notice over time that increasingly the so-called progressives were increasingly unprogressive. They were the people who didn't want to hear from anybody else. I'm trying to lead to the presence of Dr. Jordan Peterson here, a man who's been at the center of this kind of controversy for a while, and it leads to a discussion of political correctness. What has happened to our discourse in society, in particular in our institutions of higher learning, where we appear to have developed a form of student who never wants to hear a negative word. And they have come to university to find a safe place, not a place that opens up their minds and causes them to engage in ideas. So we have two speakers who are going to pursue this theme. The first is Jordan Peterson. Thank you for coming. And then we'll hear from Barbara Kay. Yeah, Jordan.
So I want to talk to you about what is politically correct and what is politically incorrect. And by politically incorrect, I mean wrong. But we'll start with what is politically correct. As far as I can tell, political correctness is a paradoxical amalgam of postmodernism, which originated as a form of philosophy and literary criticism, and Marxism or neo-Marxism. And I'll explain why that's paradoxical. I think all of the phenomena to which Moses was referring are a consequence of the juxtaposition of those two systems of ideas. And so what I want to do briefly is to explain both systems of ideas and then to critique both and their juxtaposition. And so obviously I can only deal with the central claims and hope to do that with any degree of clarity. So let's start with postmodernism. The first thing to understand about the postmodernists are that they are by no means unintelligent. Quite the contrary. Jacques Derrida, for example, and Michel Foucault, for that matter, two famous French public intellectuals who are both at or near the head of what you might describe as the postmodern intellectual revolution, are extraordinarily intellectually capable. That doesn't mean they're correct by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly means that they're more than able to put together an argument that's difficult to disentangle. And so we'll start with what I think is the most powerful central claim of postmodernism, a claim which I think is actually correct and which also has bedeviled many other fields, including, surprisingly enough, artificial intelligence. The claim is something like, there is an infinite number of ways to interpret any even finite set of phenomena. And that actually happens to be true. It's part of the reason why it's been so difficult for human beings to develop artificial intelligence and for them to develop machines that could operate in real-world environments, because it turns out that the world is so complex that perceiving it appears virtually impossible, technically speaking. We heard a little bit earlier the previous talk about embodied cognition. And one of the ways psychologists are trying to address the issue of the impossibility of perception is to note that perception isn't possible without situating the mind in a body that has a certain set of constraints. We also devote a tremendous amount of our neurological landscape to sensory processing, so that when we look at the world, it can manifest itself in the self-evident way that it appears to. But that doesn't mean that it's a simple problem. It's a very complicated problem. And the postmodernists were technically correct. There's a near infinite number of ways to perceive and interpret a finite number of phenomena. Now, you see, the thing that's interesting about that claim, apart from the fact that it happens to be technically true, is that you can use it to mount an assault on any interpretation of anything whatsoever, because there is a tremendous variability in the number of interpretations that you could bring to bear on a situation. Then you can instantly jump to the conclusion or expound the proposition that none of those interpretations should be privileged above any others. Now, that's actually wrong. And this is why postmodernism is correct in its central assumption, but incorrect in its secondary assumption. Now, the reason it's wrong is because although there is a very large number of potential interpretations of the world, that does not mean that there is an equally large number of viable interpretations of the world. Now, you might say, well, what constitutes constraints on the viability of an interpretation? And I would say, well, there's a number of them. And I think you have to understand this in the context of living creatures viewing and interpreting the world, and also within a broader evolutionary context. The way that evolution solves the problem of the infinite number of potential interpretations is by killing every single thing that interprets things badly enough to die. Right? And so, and I mean this is actually one of the most powerful arguments for the necessity of the evolutionary, for the necessity of the accuracy of the evolutionary theory. It's that, you know, it's taken 3.5 billion years of evolution to produce creatures of our sort who can interpret the world, which is impossible to interpret, well enough to live for approximately 80 years and to have some reasonable chance of propagating during that period of time. 3.5 billion years, and that's the best we've been able to do. It's a very complicated problem, and evolution solves that problem by producing a tremendous number of variants and then killing almost all of them. And so death is the solution to the problem of interpretation, and it's a terrible solution. But the point I'm trying to make there is that interpretations are constrained by such things, primary things, that happen to be relevant to living beings, like suffering and death. So those are the first sets of constraints. Your interpretations of the world should shield you to the degree possible from excess suffering and death. It doesn't seem to be too debatable a proposition unless you're aimed in the suicidal direction. And so we can start by merely pointing that out. We also might point out that such things as the necessity for cooperating and competing with others also constrains the interpretations that you're allowed in the world, especially given that not only do you have to cooperate and compete with people one time, but that you have to cooperate and compete with often the same people many times in many different contexts, and so that not only do you have to interpret the world so that you can cooperate and compete with those people, you have to do it in a manner that can be iterated and repeated. And that constitutes also an extraordinarily serious constraint. So you don't want to suffer too much, and you don't want to die, and you want to be able to cooperate with people, and you want to be able to compete with them, and you want to be able to do that over long periods of time. And then maybe you also want to do it with an aim in mind, because generally we have aims in mind, and so there are things that we like to have more than other things, and so we aim at those, and then we have to constrain our interpretation so that when we enact them in the world, the probability that what we're aiming at is going to happen will improve. And all of those constraints operate simultaneously. And what that implies, and I think Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, maybe went farther along this line of thinking than anyone else I know about anyways. It's sort of an elaboration of Kant's fundamental ethical maxim, which was something like, act as if the thing that you're doing will be done by everyone. But the Piagetian sense was more like act as if the thing that you'll be doing needs to be repeated endlessly in a manner that moves up instead of down. It's something like that. But the point is that there's tremendous constraints on the manner in which we can interpret the world from any realistic perspective. So the criticism that there are an infinite number of interpretations falls apart on closer examination. So that's the first place that the postmodernists are seriously wrong. They radically underestimated the intrinsic constraints on interpretation. Now, the central claim of Marxism, postmodernism and Marxism tend to be aligned, which is a very strange thing, is that the best way to view the world is through the lens of oppressed and oppressor and oppressed. Now, the funny thing about that is, if you're a postmodernist, is that that's actually an interpretation, right? It's a Marxist interpretation, and the interpretation is that the best way to look at the world is through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed. But if you're a postmodernist, you don't get to have a canonical interpretation, because your whole damn theory is predicated on the notion that you don't get to have a canonical interpretation because no interpretation is better than any other interpretation. So then you might ask, well, apart from the fact that the infinite number of interpretations argument is wrong in any practical sense, why in the world would you allow your postmodern deconstructionist philosophy to remain nested in Marxism? So that's the next question, because it certainly is. And if you read Derrida, for example, or Foucault, and if you look at the intellectual history of the postmodern movement, which expanded rapidly in the 1970s, you find that it's no secret that the postmodernists emerged out of an underlying Marxist framework, and they didn't abandon, they merely modified it. So it went from bourgeoisie against proletariat to, one identity group against the other, but it was still oppressor-oppressed narrative. It's just a sleight of hand. So the question is, well, why in the world, if you make the central claim that no narrative is to be privileged, why in the world would you accept your alliance with Marxism? And so the first answer to that might be the optimistic one, which is that the postmodernists and the radicals who are driving the politically correct movement are actually sincere in their desire to help the oppressed. And so we could say, having established the fact that there's an absolute plethora of interpretations, and dispensing with the notion that any of those are canonical or valued above any others, we can still act like decent human beings and try to take care of people who are less fortunate than us. Now, as an intellectual argument, that's a really bad one, because you don't get to have the first proposition and the second proposition simultaneously. But I would also say that respect for coherence and logic is not the strong suit of postmodernists, and that's actually a technical part of their theory. So, but the problem with that theory, as far as I can tell, and this actually happens to be a big problem, was that by the late 1960s, even French intellectuals as boneheaded as Jean-Paul Sartre finally had to agree that the evidence, pouring in from places like the Maoist China and the Stalinist Soviet Union, or the post-Stalinist Soviet Union, were revealing abhorrent political practices on at such a level of magnitude and undeniability that even a French intellectual had to admit that there was something wrong. And so by the end of the 1960s, it became impossible to simultaneously claim that you actually had concern for the oppressed, or even for the oppressor for that matter, and also claim that you would abide by the tenets of Marxism as a functional economic and political doctrine. No one would do that. And I think the cap was put on that by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the mid-70s. So I don't buy the postmodern argument that it's compassion that's driving the postmodern alliance with Marxism. I don't buy that a bit, because I think that if the postmodernists were compassionate and they were using that as the default aim in their life, let's say, because they don't have any other aim because of their postmodern relativism, you'd have to accept the compassion idea. But because they're ignoring the historical reality that the doctrines that they're trying to put into practice were murderous beyond belief, then I can't accept the argument that it's compassion that's driving it. So it's wrong that way too. And then the next thing is that so what's the alternative, I guess? What's the alternative? Well, Nietzsche, interestingly enough, I think figured out the alternative almost, how long is it now? More than 150 years ago now. It was pretty damn amazing. He was an amazing thinker. Nietzsche knew, for example, and he wrote about this in his notebooks in Will to Power, that the nihilistic doctrines that would emerge in the aftermath of the demolition of the theological and philosophical substructure of the West that he associated with the revelation of the death of God would produce a form of political catastrophe, and he identified it specifically, believe it or not, with communism, and that was back in like 1850, 1860. I can't believe he did it. And that would kill tens to hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century. Now, Nietzsche also said, well, maybe that wouldn't be too high a price to pay if we actually learned something from it. But it isn't obvious that we have, and it's certainly not obvious that the postmodernists that, let's say, infest the modern universities have been willing to learn anything at all from 20th century history, not least the lesson that the egalitarian and equity-oriented doctrines that they're attempting to foist upon young people in this cult-like educational manner are anything but murderous. Anyways, here's what Nietzsche said. He could really turn a phrase, man. For that man be delivered from revenge, that is for me the bridge to the highest hope, and a rainbow after long storms. The tarantulas, of course, would have it otherwise. Quote, what justice means to us is precisely that the world will be filled with the storms of our revenge. End quote. Thus they speak to each other. We shall wreak vengeance and abuse on all whose equals we are not. Thus do the tarantula hearts vow. And will to equality shall henceforth be the name for virtue. And against all that has power, we want to raise our clamor. You preachers of equality, the tyrant mania of impotence clamors thus out of you for equality. Your most secret ambition is to be tyrants and shroud yourselves in words of virtue. Well, you know, that's a pretty major criticism. And it's one that, to me, actually explains the perverse paradoxes that sit at the bottom of the otherwise ununderstandable union between the postmodernists and the Marxists. So you lay out the argument again like this. The postmodernists have it that there are no canonical interpretations of the world. I already told you why that's a foolish stance in my estimation. But even assuming it's true, then what that would mean is that you don't get to ally yourself with doctrines such as Marxism. But of course the postmodernists do. And so what that means is because you can't come up with a logical explanation for that, let's call it unholy union, you have to look elsewhere for an explanation. But you can't look to compassion itself, which is the explanation that's offered, because the doctrines that are being promoted to be implemented in the service of mankind have demonstrated themselves, as few other doctrines ever have, as murderous and tyrannical beyond belief. So you don't get that. So then what? What's left over? Well, here's another thing that's interesting about the postmodernists. In their world, there's nothing but power, right? Nothing exists but power. And so the landscape for the postmodernists is that the world is a sequence of pyramids of hierarchies of power, all of them equally unjust and unreliable, let's say, because there's an infinite number of interpretations, and all that is establishing the relationship within those hierarchies and between those hierarchies is power. Now, you know, obviously that's a conclusion that is cynical beyond comprehension and reprehensible beyond belief, not least because it reduces a very complex reality to a very simple single cause. But it also, the thing is, I've been trying to figure out why this emphasis on power above all else. Well, you think, well, the basic claim of an infinite number of interpretations is incorrect. There's no logical reason for the relationship between postmodernism and Marxism. There's no logical reason to believe on the face of the evidence that that's driven by compassion. It's allied with this sense that nothing exists but power. Well, that has me turn to Nietzsche's explanation for resentment. It's what's driving the entire enterprise is the fact that people in the academy, let's say, intellectuals in the academy, look out at the world and they notice that there are others who are respected perhaps more than they are, and there are others that have perhaps more than they are, and that goods are inequitably distributed beyond them. And the consequence of that is the emergence of the tremendous resentment that Nietzsche spoke of. The desire of that resentment is to pull down the hierarchies by criticizing them. That's the motivation for positing the infinite number of potential interpretations, because if there's an infinite number of potential interpretations and your interpretation privileges you to a particular position of power, and I can undermine your claim to the validity of that interpretation, then I can logically demolish your claim that you deserve whatever power, authority, privilege, etc. goes along with that position. While it also allows me to usurp it. It allows me to use it for my own purposes. It allows me to take power and control. And since the postmodernists have already claimed that all that exists is power, why should we assume that there's anything whatsoever that motivates them, especially given the other incoherent paradoxes that are a part and parcel of the doctrine and its alliance with Marxism? Why should we assume that it is anything at all other than the naked will to power that motivates and activates the doctrine? Well, that's what I've been thinking about for like intensely, more intensely than usual, for about the last 8 months. You know, and I've got it boiled down to something approximating 15 minutes, which is a period of time that's a bit short to deal with such things, but I would certainly at least invite you to think about it, because I don't see that I haven't been able to figure out any way out of the logical argument that I just presented to you. And if that argument is correct, then that's a diagnosis for what's happening in the politically correct world and actually what its motivations are. And I believe that my argument is, it's accurate. It's accurate. And it's destroying the universities. And it's invading the rest of our society. And the idea that there's something good behind it, that's a dangerous idea. I don't think so. I think what's behind it is exactly what Nietzsche noted 150 years ago. It's resentment and the demand for power, disguising itself most reprehensibly as compassion. And it's time for the mask of that to be taken off and things set straight before we walk further down a path that will lead to no good than we've already walked down. Thank you.
Jordan, stay there. Stay there for a second. Just to help the audience, I'd like to bring it back to the shitstorm that was created by the fact, if I understood it correctly, that you refuse to address trans people by the pronouns that they claim to prefer, that there are many such pronouns, that there are suddenly many more genders than we have previously been familiar with, and that you took the position that the language is based on him and her, and that's how you were going to continue to talk to people. Is that an accurate description of the situation?
No, with all due respect, it's not. I mean, it's approximately accurate, but it's not accurate in the details. When I made the first video criticizing Bill C-16, which the Canadian Senate just approved yesterday, by the way, so now compelled speech, by the way, is a reality in Canada, or will be soon. When I made the first video, what I said was that I objected to the legislated necessity to use a kind of language that had its roots in a philosophy that I regard as detestable, and that would be the postmodern neo-Marxist ideology. And these pronouns, the transgender issue is a sideshow as far as I'm concerned, and believe me, as far as many transgender people are concerned too, because many of them have written to me. The issue isn't that. It's that when you cede linguistic territory, especially by legislative fiat, to your ideological opponents, they win. And as far as I'm concerned, they're not going to win because by getting me to say what they want me to say, because I'm not going to say what they want me to say. Now, I never refused to address any student whatsoever by any pronoun at all. And what I said when I made the videos was, not only was this bill producing a legislative structure, especially when interpreted within the policy guidelines of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is how it's going to be interpreted, that legislated compelled speech, it also instantiated a postmodern, neo-Marxist, social constructionist view of gender into our legal fabric, which is exactly what happened. And if you think that's going to be good for transgender people or homosexual people, you got a second thought coming. Because one of the things that's claimed in that legislation is that sexual identity in its various sorts is purely socioculturally constructed, which is what the right-wing conservatives have been telling the homosexuals since like 1920. So we've just written a law that purports to protect people who vary, let's say, in their gender identity, and by implication, say, their sexual identity. We've just written in a doctrine that the enemies of that idea have been using for 60 years to say, well, if it's just socioculturally determined, why don't you just stop doing it? Which is exactly the right response. So anyways, I made this video saying that I wasn't going to use these words, and what happened, and why. And what happened was, well, initially I was, called out, and perhaps rightly so, because you should call out social critics, right? That's what you should do. I was challenged in relationship to my potential bigotry and racism and all the other things that are casually thrown at people when they make a public statement about such things. But no, it didn't have anything to do with actually refusing to address any given student by any given pronoun. I mean, you never address people by third-person pronouns anyways, right? It's just not something that happens. Now, one other thing, sorry to be so lengthy in the answer, but the other thing I would like to point out is that if this was about the pronouns that should be used to address transgender people, like 1,000 people would have watched that video. It would have bored most of them to death, and it would have disappeared in about 15 seconds from the public imagination. And that is not what's happened. And that's because that's not what this is about. So it's about, I think, I don't think I formulated my argument as perfectly as I could have today, but I'm getting close to getting it down to like a 15-minute, solid 15-minute. Yeah. So.